Okay, Peter.
Right, I'd like to welcome you all to the NSA Scotland webinar on sheep worrying with dogs. A very poignant topic tonight. I appreciate you coming in from the lambing fields or lambing sheds and watching this, but it's really, really important that we feature this, and we've got two experts here that we're going to hear from that'll give us sound advice, I'm sure. So I'll not rabbit on too much. I'd like to welcome Ramsay Hall, a Senior Associate at Brodies LLP Solicitors. Ramsay is ranked as a Senior Associate to watch for the legal directories for financial crime and fraud. And he's significant experience of advising clients in the rural business sector and regulatory concerns. And we also have Mike Urquhart, a rural crimes expert in the Northeast. He covers the Northeast and covers a lot of rural crime. And he's the man to go to with the police, and he'll give us some food for thought, I'm very sure. So I think we'll start with our regional coordinator, Grace Reid, who has got the summary of the NSA consultation process for sheep worrying with dogs, and she'll start off tonight's webinar. On you go, Grace. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and just bear with me while I get the presentation up. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes here going through this year's sheep worrying by dog survey results. It's just the highlights. The full results can be found on our website. So here we go. So unfortunately, this year's results have again shown another trend in the fact that this is expected to be the norm. Sheep worrying is going to happen no matter what. It's going to be any dog, any breed, any length of training that's went into it, and it is out of control in the country. But we all know that because we are here for a reason, and we have seen the incidences across the UK and Scotland to date, and the resolution of this is still unanswered. Despite farmers making steps to prevent sheep worrying and coming together in collaboration with the communities and society, and also putting up signs and trying to do increased checks, it's still not making an impact. And this is really a people problem, not a dog problem. In terms of the greater legislative support in Scotland, we have seen that come through, and Ramsay and Mike will both be speaking about that later on, where we've got ends. But the rest of the UK are really looking towards Scotland at the minute to implement stronger powers across the UK, and we are also engaged in discussions about the increased countryside access in England and Wales. We also feel very strongly about the fact that we need to keep dogs on a lead in the vicinity of sheep and livestock, and even the greater wildlife at large, and possibly looking into a license/registration scheme for dogs in terms of traceability. So that's a wee bit of a quick summary into what the survey results have shown this year. But in terms of what farmers can do, a greater impact is shown through reporting all cases of sheep worrying by dogs, no matter how severe they may be and how much authority. So in all, this week is part of our week-long campaign, which is an annual basis. So having a very quick look at what we try to do, we've come up with dog checklists, we've come up with signs, we've come up with all these things. We spoke to vets, we spoke to every kind of person you can think of in society to try and get this message through of responsible dog ownership. Interestingly, this year it's mostly actually NSA members that have filled in the survey, and disappointingly 70% of respondents had a sheep worrying incident, with 75% of respondents having between 1 to 10 animals involved at the same time. In most cases, it's actually one dog that's doing the worrying or injuring, and there's still concerns over the lack of education and irresponsible dog ownership, as already mentioned. The other amazing thing about this survey is the fact that 86% of farmers were not alerted by owners. That is not a surprising statistic, but it is a very, very high number that cannot be ignored. So this here survey looks at the number of sheep injured and killed within an incident itself. And the attacks have actually increased back to the 2020 and 2016 survey levels. There has been a slight drop in the number of sheep killed in a sheep worrying incident, but this doesn't take into account that 60% of respondents reported production losses in sheep and or miscarriage in ewes as a result of sheep worrying. This may be the reason for a slight decrease in the average number of sheep killed, as there's a time lag between the sheep worrying event and losses or injuries observed, but it still shows that it's a problem and it's not going to go away. Respondents felt that the majority of cases are caused by the dog not being on control, or they're off lead and the owner assuming that the dog won't attack. This suggests that increased education and responsibility could reduce the incidences, but lack of education, irresponsible dog owner, the professional dog, there's been so many kind of main causes identified through this survey as to why an incident can take place. And there's also a high percentage of the members have shown signs. Sorry about that. So in my own case, I've had a case of sheep worrying with dogs, and there's a few recent ones happening at the moment. And most times that the farmer comes across an incident itself or an attack, and someone else alerts them fact that it has taken place. This also suggests that animals are often likely to be left suffering or injured for a period of time, causing extreme distress to the sheep and also the farmer discovering the upsetting scenes. So that is, if anything else was causing this amount of animal welfare issues to our livestock, the public would be up in arms about it. And it's a simple fact that their dog is causing it, that it seems to be okay. This is just a very quick word cloud of the emotions and the words that the farmers are feeling, and it again highlights the fact that it's unnecessary, it's traumatic, it's frustrating, and it's disappointing as a few. Again, it highlights the fact that the comments like becoming the norm and expected was another frequency that should not be allowed. The farmers were left to pick up the pieces. 61% of our members had a negative response from the owner when they approached to see why their dog wasn't on a lead. And they also get very mixed outcomes when they do try to speak to dog owners when they see them accessing their fields or out and about on the farm. But what can we do to overcome this? Education is a key element in changing attitudes and behaviours to benefit all. We all want to see responsible access taken of the countryside through the Scottish Outdoor Access Code. And the environment around us it's always there to be enjoyed by all. But again, there's still that negative attitude presented by the public when farmers are just trying to go about their daily business. So 70% of respondents experienced abuse, intimidation, refusal, and general negativity when personally asking dog owners to put their pet in a lead. That is not a statistic that we should be proud of as a society at all. In terms of reporting sheep worrying to the police, there has been an increase in the number of respondents who are no longer reporting sheep worrying incidents. And without that statistics, NSA, the industry and police cannot get policy changed across the UK as a whole. If you don't report the incident, there won't be a statistic, and then that'll downplay the actual occurrences across the UK. And when we're trying to fight for higher legislation, it makes the job so much more difficult. So if you are in that position, can you please report your incidents as and when you can? So that's that. And I also thought it'd be interesting to pull out this statistics and these numbers. So as part of the survey, we also ask the respondents to rate the police on a scale of 1 to 10. You've seen, particularly in Scotland in 2021, we started off with about 2 points, which would have been significant of the new legislative powers coming into force, and maybe the police responded more appropriately. But unfortunately, in 2023, we've slipped back down to 3.17. The average across the UK is 4 out of 10. So there's certainly more work to be done there. It does vary across the different regions and the different police forces and everyone involved. But I think as a whole, NSA stakeholders, the police, SSPCA, everyone involved in these incidents have a duty to work together to get the best outcome possible. And in terms of compensation, not everyone does pursue compensation. It doesn't always stack up to how much you feel that you should receive, and nor does it come even close to addressing the emotional impacts felt by farmers. And again, sometimes you have animals that are worth quite a lot of money, and also time over the generation. Ethics, it just cannot be accounted for. So on compensation, and a very quick overview of that. And this is maybe just more relevant for across the rest of the UK. There is additional powers needed, 82%. That's a very, very strong percentage that feel so strongly about this that something needs to be done. If we were not in the same position as we are in Scotland, we would be forefront of moving this legislation forward and hopefully being a wee bit further down the line in terms of actually following through on it. And again, another quite short piece on who should take responsibility for the action. So the survey showed that we need to work together as a nation. We need to work together as an industry. There should be the vets, police, farmers, breed societies, everyone you can think of should be campaigning for this and promoting the responsible outdoor access. People are becoming more and more complacent when they're out and about, and that should not overrule the responsibility when you are actually accessing the countryside. So you can find all these here survey results on the NSA website, and I will hand over to Ramsay.
Thank you, Grace. If you, I must reiterate, you know, as Grace said, if you have an incident, no matter if you think nothing will happen about it, just report it. The more statistics we get of reported incidents, the better for the future. So make sure and report it. Okay, Ramsay, if you want to do your presentation, Grace, can you put Ramsay's presentation up, please?
Thanks, Grace. Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everyone. So as Peter says, I'm a regulatory lawyer at Brodies. I advise the rural sector on the full range of rural offences. So that includes wildlife crime, firearms offences, animal welfare, and of course, sheep worrying and attacking. I was also part of the team at Brodies that drafted the legislation amending the Dogs Protection of Livestock Act 1953. So hopefully with that I'll have a decent insight into sheep worrying offences as they currently stand in Scotland. And if we could just move on, Grace, please, what I'm proposing to do in the presentation is to cover the offence, the penalties that can be imposed, a summary of cases, and at the end provide some tips on responding to incidents. So what is the offence? Well, the Dogs Protection of Livestock Act of 1953, as amended by the 2021 Act, provides that it's an offence where a dog attacks or worries livestock on agricultural land. And in the 1953 Act, it explains that the owner of the dog commits an offence, and if the dog's in charge of another person, that person also is guilty of an offence. So point number one for me is that there's two people that can commit offences, both the owner and the person in charge. And what the 2021 Act did, is amongst various things, was it added the wording attacks or. So previously it was worries, a dog worries livestock. Now it's attacks or worries. And what's the impact of attacks? Well, the impact of attacks is set out there in the final part of the screen. It didn't alter the scope of the offence. The same behaviours continue to constitute the offence, but the legislation drafters, and Brodies advised them in the background, wanted to ensure that the word attack was given greater prominence in the legislation and the language of the offence better reflected its seriousness. And I think that's a really important point to flag. The Scottish Government at the time ultimately wanted to reflect that this is a serious offence. There was a concern that the terminology sheep worrying wasn't deemed serious enough, and there was a desire to move away from that. And if we can just flick on to the next slide at this stage, please, Grace, that'd be appreciated. I think we've gone back one instead of forward one. So what does the offence mean? Yeah, we're there. So worrying livestock is defined in a very broad way, chasing livestock in such a way as may reasonably be expected to cause injury or suffering to the livestock, or in the case of females, abortion or loss of diminution in their produce. Now, my point on that is be expected to cause injury. You don't need actual injury, it's be expected to cause injury. Or worrying livestock can mean being at large, so not in control in a field or enclosure in which there are sheep. And as I say there, it's a broad offence. It's designed to capture a range of behaviour. And I say they're falling short of an attack on causing injury, because if an attack causes injury, then what you would expect to see is that the investigation and prosecution, it relates to sheep attacking. And that's the change that was introduced by the 2021 Act. So if we can keep moving on, please, Grace, to the next slide. Here I put down for you the definitions. Now that's very wordy. The definition in the 1953 Act there of both livestock and agricultural land. For present purposes, I'll simply rest on the fact that livestock includes obviously sheep, as well as a range of other animals. And I think it's worth noting that there might be, not amongst this group certainly, but amongst the general public, perhaps a misconception that sheep worrying really only relates to sheep. It does not at all. The 1953 Act applies to a much broader range of livestock animals. And similarly, agricultural land is defined broadly, certainly in my interpretation of it, and would include the very vast majority of for instance, farmland. And that, again, that's intentional. It's intentional. It's both terms were given broad definitions so as to include as far as possible as many different types of livestock and as much agricultural land as could be included. If we can just go on from there, please, Grace. I suppose a note of caution for me on the legal side, and there I've provided a couple of exceptions. Before I get into those two exceptions, I should flag that I mentioned earlier that sheep worrying can include a dog being at large and otherwise not in close control. That doesn't apply to, for instance, police dogs. So that there are, within the 1953 Act, there are some specific carve-outs in relation to that aspect of the offence, but more broadly, no offence is committed under the 1953 Act if at the relevant time, and the relevant time is when the sheep worrying or attacking takes place, the livestock is trespassing on the land in question, and the dog is owned by the occupier of that land. So that's point number one. Point number two is a partial exception in as much as the owner of the dog in question won't be convicted if they can prove that at the time of the attacking or worrying, the dog was in the charge of someone else whom they reasonably believe to be a fit and proper person to be in charge of the dog. And there's a couple of things in that. One, if that sort of set of circumstances apply, it doesn't mean that there can be no offence at all. It means that the primary focus would be on the person who was in charge of the dog. But point number two is there's an onus on the owner to prove that A, someone else was in charge at the relevant time, and B, and this sometimes can be a wee bit difficult, but B, that they reasonably believe that person to be a fit and proper person to be in charge of the dogs. So there's almost an onus of a burden of proof on them to demonstrate that reasonable belief that was held. Keep going, please, Grace, if that's okay with you. potential penalties, and potential penalties, I suppose, was the headline grabbing change of the amendments implemented by the 2021 Act. Now under the legislation, the potential penalties are imprisonment of an individual of up to 12 months, a fine not exceeding £40,000, or both. Now, previously, before the amendments in the 2021 Act, we were looking at, for instance, a £5,000 fine. So you can see a significant increase in the potential penalties that can be imposed, and what was hoped that was intentional, because it was to reflect the point I made earlier about the seriousness of the offence. Remember, I said that attacking was expressly included to reflect the seriousness of the offence. So too was this increase in the level of sentences that can be imposed on individuals found guilty or convicted of the offence. Other measures were included. 2 examples: a person can be disqualified from owning or keeping a dog for a period of time. And separately, a person can be prohibited from taking a dog on agricultural land on which livestock is present or is likely to be present. Those are additional orders that can be imposed by a court in the event of a conviction for sheep worrying and attacking. And in the event of those orders being imposed but breached, so say for instance someone's disqualified from owning or keeping a dog, they nonetheless decide to take steps to purchase a dog, that breach of the order is in and of itself a criminal offence. There could be prosecution proceedings raised in respect of that criminal offence with a maximum fine of £5,000. So you can envisage set of circumstances where there's a prosecution in respect of the sheep worrying / attacking offence, a sentence is imposed, including an order, so for instance, disqualification order, a breach of that order, and then a second and separate prosecution is raised. And again, these were amendments made by the 2021 Act to give the court, to give sentencing sheriffs more powers at their disposal, to mark the seriousness of the offences, but also to try to discourage repeat offences, to try to hit home to people owning or in charge of dogs behaving in this way, that it's unacceptable, and the courts will send that message. That was the theory behind it. And I suppose if we can go on, Grace, to the next slide, the question is, well, has that theory followed through into practice as yet? And if you want my honest answer to that, I think the answer is no, not yet, but we're moving perhaps slowly in the right direction. So you'll see there, I've given you a summary of, and these are just a sample of cases. There is a spate of, as Peter referred to earlier, and Grace has given us really useful stats on, there's a spate of these type of offences in Scotland and across the UK. What we're seeing is a gradual increase in the punishments being imposed. Now, and that's positive, but we'll just pause there. I don't think the increases are as high as certainly this group would hope they will become. And Grace and I were having a conversation earlier about that, and Grace asked me a very good question as well. What will it take? What will it take for the sentencing sheriffs to impose the full powers at their disposal? And what I said was, experience suggests to me that when new legislation's enacted, there's always a bit of hesitancy to use the new powers. It's easy and it's convenient and it's comforting to go with what was happened in the past and what's always been done in terms of the 1953 Act. So there's a degree of hesitancy, but with other legislation, what I've seen is that as soon as one sheriff is brave enough to do it, the others follow. So I think as soon as you get one case in which there's a big fine and, for instance, a disqualification order, I think you will see the others follow in line. Just to fly through some of these. So in 2018, we've got a sheep worrying case. The fine was £300 and £100 in compensation. So that's me signalling there. I've used that case intentionally because that's a very low level in terms of the penalty that's imposed. It's very minor. Sorry, it's not minor. What happened wasn't minor, but the message being sent by the court, and I'm afraid is that the court felt it was a very minor offence. Move forward to 2019. This is a serious case. 4 dogs seriously injured and killed 17 sheep. Sentence was 80 hours community service, no fine. I'm not aware of a compensation order being imposed in that case. Very lenient in my legal view. I don't think that hits home the right message. And you'll bear in mind, of course, this is all before the 2021 Act came in place. Similarly, 2019, another case, 3 Jack Russells attacked sheep. The owner was fined, a minor sum of £300. Now, contrast that, I suppose, with a case in 2022 where a dog owner was prosecuted in circumstances where his dog killed and seriously injured sheep. The owner was ordered to pay a fine of £200. That's still very low. But importantly here, in this case, he was ordered to pay £2,650 in compensation to the owner of the sheep, which in the grand scheme of things is not an insignificant sum of money. And that might not have been full redress. I appreciate that, but it's an improvement or an enhancement of where we've been in the past. The owner was also banned from taking dogs onto agricultural land, so that was a use of one of the additional orders that I flagged earlier. And the sheriff, in passing sentence in that case, said that farmers are rightly concerned about dogs running wild and worrying their sheep. So that was a reflection from the courts that this sort of thing is rightly of concern. The final one is that in the last couple of days, there's been press reporting about the Kelty farmer who's lost 16 lambs in a dog attack. Now, there's already been press coverage around that, and there will be no doubt further coverage. And I suppose just from a legal point of view, we should just wait and see whether the proceedings will be raised in respect of that incident. Taking my lawyer's hat off, I do have to say that I think the more press reporting of this sort of thing, the better, because the message hits home to the general public that this is serious, that has a big impact on the rural community. And on that, Grace, if we can just go to the next slide, please. Powers of investigation. So I'm not going to integrate detail at all on powers of investigation, because Mike, being with Police Scotland, will have far better experience of this than I'll simply rest on the fact that the point that the 1953 Act does contain powers, as amended powers to seize and detain dogs, to have dogs examined by a vet. There's also scope for the seeking of a warrant, and a warrant is a court order to take additional steps. So, for instance, to enter premises where access has otherwise been refused. So there are powers of investigation with a view to identifying the relevant dog in question. But as I say, I'll say no more on that from now, because Mike's going to cover it far better than I could. If we can go on then, please, Grace. And just to flag to everyone, this is my penultimate slide. Recovery. I well understand that the audience will have a vested interest in there being a criminal prosecution because of the sense of justice. It's the right thing to happen. But in addition to that, there's a commercial element to this. Many of you will be running businesses, and the loss of sheep costs money, and sometimes significant sums of money. Why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant in this context because in the criminal system in Scotland, a compensation order can be imposed by a criminal court. A compensation order is a financial penalty. It's imposed on a convicted person, the proceeds of which are paid to the victim of the crime. The victim of the crime in cases like this is the owner of the sheep. And it covers personal injury, loss or damage caused directly or indirectly, or alarm or distress caused directly. So if we just take that for a second, personal injury is not applicable here. Loss or damage, so a loss caused directly or indirectly. Think about the losses that are incurred by someone who experiences sheep worrying. Those can be fairly significant in nature. The way that a compensation order works is that they can only be sought by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in Scotland. That's the sole prosecuting body in Scotland. And the Crown Office, COPFS on the slides, can only seek a compensation order in the event of a successful prosecution. So the way that it works is you have a sheep worrying incident that's reported to the authorities. Police Scotland investigate. In an ideal world, they charge someone and that person is prosecuted by the COPFS. In an ideal world, that person is convicted of the offence and they are sentenced, and COPFS make a submission to the criminal court to impose a compensation order. What I would say about that process is COPFS will not do that off their own volition. They're not going to do it necessarily off their own back. It requires engagement with COPFS. The earlier, the better. So that will require either the owner of the sheep or their legal representative engaging with the authorities to say, I wish a compensation order to be requested from a court. Here's how much I think the order should be for. And here's the vouching supporting that quantification. Ultimately, it's for a criminal court to decide whether to grant a compensation order. But to put it plainly, if you don't ask, you don't get. So I think it's well worth bearing that in mind. If it's not, one other point on that, if it's not granted, a sheriff should explain why it's not granted, and I think that's useful to note. So there should be some form of justification as to why it's not granted. Now, all of this is in the context of criminal proceedings. A civil court action for recovery can separately be raised. That's a separate option. That's not related to criminal proceedings. Well, all I'm going to say about those is that the process of raising civil proceedings can be expensive, can be lengthy, and that there's no guarantee, as is the case with any sort of court action, of success. And in my experience, some folks I've spoken to in this world have been far more attracted to the idea of engaging with COPFS and seeking a compensation order and not raising a civil action for recovery. Now, it's not an either or. It's not an either or, but that's the experience, certainly, of people I've spoken with and with clients that I've assisted in this sphere. And then on that, Grace, if we can just move on, please, to my final slide, which is responding to incidents and some sort of top tips. This is my advice: report to the authorities immediately with a view to encouraging investigation and prosecution. And I think that's very important. And I know I agree entirely with what Grace and Peter said earlier about the importance of this. I can understand why some people might be reluctant to do so where they've had a bad experience previously. But if these sorts of incidents aren't reported, the authorities don't know about them, so there's no scope for an investigation and prosecution. It's also very difficult to drive further change if we don't have to hand full knowledge of the incidents. And if you think about it, look at the press coverage. So look at the case in Kelty for a second. That press coverage, I think, makes it far more likely that evidence will be gathered with a view to supporting a prosecution. Because I think it's more likely that as a result of that press coverage, the owner of the dog in question, or the person in charge of the dog in question, may be identified. Now, if Stuart McDougall, who's the person who's reported the incident and certainly to the press, hadn't raised the issue and hadn't been brave enough to speak to the press about it, we might not know about it. So, as I say, be bold, be brave would be my take on it. As a lawyer, I will, of course, say this: seek legal support on engaging with the authorities and recovery options. That's absolutely a choice. You don't need to do that. And I can well understand why some people might. I've seen the benefits of it myself. And for instance, the benefits are that we've got working relationships with Police Scotland and with COPFS. We know how they work, we know who the key people are. And for instance, I've got experience of engaging with COPFS to encourage them to seek from criminal courts compensation orders, and indeed I've got experience of being successful in persuading a criminal court to grant compensation orders. So it can be beneficial. Retention of evidence is very important. And I know what Grace said earlier about the idea of being aware that an incident's occurred, but not knowing when it happened. That can make it difficult to gather evidence with a view to encouraging investigation and prosecution. Do what you can, though. Do as much as you can. There's only so far you can go in circumstances, but do as much as you can to assist the police and to assist COPFS. Take photographs. That's a really accurate record at the time, because that shows the extent of the damage. Take an inventory of the livestock harmed, including the number of harmed sheep, lambs, and take a note of the extent of the injuries. If vet reports are required, keep hold of them. Steps to trace the dog in question, their owner, the person in charge of them. How far do you go? You've got to be careful with this, because you don't want to end up inadvertently in a position whereby you become the focus of the authorities because they deem that you've gone about sort of vigilante investigation, and then you've taken steps such as would put someone in a state of fear and alarm, because that can be a criminal offence of itself. So, for instance, if you go around chapping on folks' doors saying, "Are you the owner of this dog?" You got to be careful with that. There are other ways to go about it, though. There are social media can be used today. We've seen that actually, like the Kelty case is a classic example. I think the press can be used to the advantage. Local knowledge can be used. So eyewitness accounts are really important to gather. So if someone's told you about it, told you about an incident, that's really helpful. But take time to spend half an hour to an hour with that person and really drill down into exactly what they saw. Can they describe anyone who was in the vicinity of the dog? Can they describe the dog? Of course, that's really important. The breed, the colour, the size, etc., etc. And any distinguishing features. But similarly, can they describe any people who were in the vicinity? What did they look like? How tall they were? Were they male, female? What were they wearing? All of that can be really useful for the authorities. I'm not suggesting you become amateur detectives, far from it. And what I'm suggesting is you do as much as possible to assist the authorities. Final point for me is a point that the panel were discussing just before we started the webinar. Just be careful. This can be a very frustrating set of circumstances to occur. I completely get that, and I do sympathise if it does. But make sure you protect yourself. Don't let the red mist descend. You have the power to shoot a dog as a measure of last resort, and I emphasise that, as a measure of last resort to protect livestock. Be careful when exercising that power if you choose to do it. A measure of last resort is point number one. To protect the livestock is point number two. So if you find out after the event that livestock have been harmed or indeed killed, any steps you take at that stage after the event wouldn't be with a view to protecting livestock. It would be a reaction. And in those set of circumstances, you may find yourself in hot water. So all I'm saying is be careful there. So you've got that power, but be careful, because what the worst case scenario here is you are the victim, but inadvertently do something that makes you the focus of a police investigation. Far better to be in a position whereby you are reporting to the authorities and working with them as they investigate matters with a view to encouraging a prosecution and a sensible outcome in the course of that prosecution. And on that, that ends my presentation, which I hope was helpful. Of course, I understand there's going to be questions at the end of the session, and I'm very happy to answer any questions directed to me.
Thank you very much, Ramsay. If you type in the wee bitty at the top corner, or certainly on my tablet, if you type in questions, and we'll hopefully try and answer them if you have some questions later on. Just a couple of questions I have for Ramsay. Can the sheriff have the dog destroyed, or is that the sheriff doesn't have that power?
So in respect of the 1953 Act, Peter, I don't think that a sheriff can, but there is other legislation in which dogs can be destroyed. So there's a dangerous dogs act, dogs dangerously out of control. It depends on I'm going to say it depends, that's a classic lawyer's answer. It depends on what the prosecution looks like and what the finding is. So there are potentially circumstances where dogs can be destroyed, orders can be made for that, yes, in principle.
And the other question that came up in my head was, as a land occupier, a landowner that has sheep on the land, can you insist, do you have power to insist that people put their dogs on the lead?
My gut response to that is no. I don't think you've got that power to insist on that, Peter. The law, as far as I'm aware, does not place an obligation on dog owners to keep their dogs on the lead. It places an obligation to keep the dogs under control. That's not necessarily the same thing.
Close control, yes.
Good point, agreed. Sorry, you're absolutely right. Close control, and close control is the wording in the legislation. Close control, but that doesn't necessarily mean on the lead.
Yes,
in my view, yes. If say I'm a dog owner, and my obligation is to keep my dog under close control, that means on the lead. That's how I do that. That's the practical way of keeping them under close control. Yes.
Because I confronted somebody a year or two back, and he says, no, it's under close control. That's the legal implication. And I thought, okay. So I'm pleased you were able to clarify that, Ramsay. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. No problem at all.
Aye. Now we'll have Mike Urquhart, if he will tell us from the police's point of view where you stand. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, evening, folks. My name's Mike Urquhart. I'm one of the crime reduction officers that covers the northeast of Scotland. I'd like to give a brief summary to start with, how to report a livestock worrying incident, and also the type of information that the police are looking for when you phone in. Corroboration being one of the key elements that we're after, and I'll explain what that is shortly. So if you're reporting a livestock incident, a livestock worrying incident, if it's ongoing, please don't hesitate to call 999. There's a lot of hesitancy among the public to phone 999 because they think it's for emergencies only. But if a crime is ongoing, then it's definitely 999. If you turn up at a field where an incident has already happened and the suspects have left, then you can dial 101, the emergency is over. Or, arguably quicker, you can go to the Police Scotland website and use the Contact Us form to report the incident. That's www.scotland.police.uk, and there's a little Contact Us button on there. And your report will be treated in exactly the same way, and it's a lot quicker. 101 can be quite slow. So when you phone the police, what are we after? So take note of the date and time that the incident happened. Now, when you phone in, remember that the call handler that you're speaking to might not be that au fait with rural crime. So describe what's happened and explain to the call handler that livestock worrying is an offence under the Dogs Protection Act. The call handler might not be familiar, like I say, with rural crime, so it's important to explain that and explain that it is actually an offence. If possible, provide a map reference. You can use what 3 words, it's a great resource, or ideally a grid reference of both the incident scene and location from where you witnessed the incident. What 3 words is great for calling the emergency services for any kind of incident, and in a rural location especially. And remember, please don't use local names when you're describing a location, because the person you're speaking to could be from Dundee or Edinburgh and not necessarily local to your area. As Ramsay said, take a note of any witness details. People that saw what happened, so their names, addresses, contact phone numbers, email, that sort of thing. And keep a note. When you phone the police, you'll be given an incident number, so keep a note of that, because when you make contact with the police in future, it makes it far easier for the police to find out, to refer back to that incident and get back in touch with you. So if you come across an incident that's ongoing, first and foremost, be a good witness, but don't put yourself in any danger. If you believe that the suspects or the person in charge of that dog may be aggressive or confrontational, then don't approach them or intervene. Keep yourself safe. Your own safety comes first. And record as much information as you can. As Ramsay's already said, note a description of the persons involved, including their gender, age, height, clothing. Note as much detail as you can about the dog, breed, colour, size, was it wearing a collar, any distinguishing marks. And remember, in Scotland, there's a need for corroboration. So it's not enough for you to say that you've seen somebody do something. One piece of evidence has to be backed up by another piece of evidence. So if possible, take photographs of the suspects, of the dog. Even better, record a video. Now, there's absolutely no issue at all with photographing or videoing somebody that's committed or is committing an offence. That's just recording evidence of a crime or an offence that's happening. So there's no issue with you getting your phone out and recording that person. Write down any vehicle registration numbers, make, model, colour that might be involved. That will help help us track them down. If you can, identify other witnesses and obtain their details. And any notes that you take at the time of the incident, keep those as well, because we might use those in evidence as well. Now, if there are dead sheep, cover up any carcasses to prevent animals coming into contact with them. Photograph or video them in the location before they've been moved. Get close-ups, but also photograph the field in general. Video is really good. It's very, very powerful in court. If you're taking an injured animal to the vets, record the injuries. Again, photograph or video, and keep a note of the vet's details as well, because we'll need to get a statement from them to speak to the injuries that have been caused. Now, as we said, if you manage to capture a dog involved in the incident, there may be opportunities to gather forensic evidence as well. So again, photograph and video the dog and any blood on the dog. Now, a vet may be able to make the dog sick as well, so to produce any wool ingested. DNA samples might also be possible from the dog's teeth and gums, but that would depend on the passage of time as well. So between the incident happening and getting that dog to a vet. So as we said, the police have the power to seize a dog suspected of being involved in a livestock worrying incident, and to take that dog to the vets to obtain samples. And as we said before, legislation is also in place for us to get a warrant or to apply for a warrant to search property in order to gather evidence as well. Now, as Ramsay has mentioned, and I'd like to reinforce, you do have the power to shoot a dog, but it is an absolute last resort. And if you are happy that there's absolutely no other way to protect your livestock and the incident is ongoing, you have the right to shoot that dog, but it must be an ongoing livestock incident, and there must be absolutely no alternative, and you have to be happy with that. And finally, for me, although I've spoken about the need for corroboration under Scots law, please always report an incident. Even if it's just you don't have that corroboration, it's just yourself that's witnessed something, it's really, really important that you report it. The police will always investigate an incident to the best of their ability. So even if you think you're on your own, there's no point in reporting it, please do. As we've said already, we can't do anything unless we know about it, and the more we know about it, the better. Briefly, that was me. Peter, back to you.
Thank you, Mike. We have a question from Robert Laird. He was asking, if you shoot the dog, can the owner still be prosecuted if you kill the dog in the act of worrying the sheep in the field?
Yes. Yes is the short answer to Robert's good question. So suppose if you think about it, the offence has been committed. That's what's relevant for the purposes of the investigation and the prosecution and sentencing. So the offence of sheep worrying and attacking has been committed in the circumstances that Robert asked about. That the fact that the dog was killed doesn't really matter to the question of whether or not there's going to be a prosecution. And it also doesn't matter to the question of whether the compensation can be sought, because again, if you think it through, by that point in time, by the point in time of the shooting of the dog, the damage, the loss could have been incurred, the injury, the death to the sheep.
Thank you. Is there any other questions coming in? Oh, I think I've seen something just appeared just now. If I could get the blinking thing to work. Oh yes, anonymous attendee. If a dog was to be shot as a last resort but wasn't killed, what are our legal responsibilities in terms of animal welfare, and who would foot the vet's bill for any care given to the dog? That's a good one.
That is a good one. Mike, I'll have a stab at it. So if you think it through. So you're not the dog owner. You're not in charge of the dog. Those people have responsibility for a dog. But if you've shot a dog, not killed it, I think there's an argument. I think my gut is that there's an argument that you have some sort of responsibility to take it to a vet, and I think or to get otherwise medical treatment for it. From an appropriately qualified person. I'm not saying you treat it yourself. And there was a case about that recently in the press. Where it was a wildlife crime, and an estate gamekeeper was treating dogs that he was used in fighting in a nasty set of circumstances. So different from this, but I think you do have a legal responsibility. Who would foot the vet's bill? There'll be an argument about that. I think in the first instance, you're shooting the dog, you're taking it to the vet, you're getting the bill from the vet. Would be my immediate thought. So perhaps another reason, it's a good question, and therefore perhaps another reason just to be very, very wary of this right to shoot. I think that's the way I would end it. And Mike, I don't know if you agree, disagree, you've got any different thoughts.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Ramsay. That I think if you've got an injured animal, regardless of the circumstances, then there's an onus on you to look after that animal. And you have a responsibility to do that. How you fight over the vet's bills after is immaterial, really. It's the immediate care of that animal is the priority.
And hopefully you'd be able to claim the vet's bill back from the court, provided there was a successful prosecution.
Oofed. You could have a stab at it, Peter. I think you need a decent lawyer to try and persuade the Crown Office to go for that. That feels a wee bit tenuous to me off the top of my head. If you're the one shooting it and you're humming and hawing about it, Peter, you could have a stab at it.
Yeah. Okay. Mike, there's no questions just yet. Could you suggest what other activities Police Scotland are engaging with to raise awareness and clamp down on this issue as a proactive service rather than reactive?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. So starting in the Northeast Division next week, the Northeast Partnership Against Rural Crime is launching a campaign that's going to run. It's next Wednesday. We're starting actually up at Loch Mick, and it's a responsible countryside access campaign, which includes dog ownership and responsible dog ownership. And we're going to be attending lots of hotspot areas across the D-side corridor in the first instance. We're working, so it's going to be, police are going to be there, Aberdeenshire Council, access officer, dog warden, local estates and ranger service are all going to be working together. Like I say, we're going to be targeting those hotspot areas where we get lots of tourists and lots of dog walkers, working with the rangers and working with the countryside access officers to promote responsible behaviour. Like I say, there's going to be dog stuff involved as well. So the dog warden will be there. I think we even have a dog agility course set up. So next Wednesday at Loch Mick, everybody's welcome to come along. I'll be there along with all the partnership agencies. But like I say, that'll be running right throughout the summer.
Thank you, Mike. I've got another question just come in. What can be done when a farmer comes across an attack, but there has been no witnesses or evidence of the dog or its owner? Is there anything we can do? Yeah,
absolutely, Peter. I mean, we do report. I mean, the circumstances are very, very difficult. Any crime that happens in the countryside where there are no witnesses, whether it's a livestock worrying incident or a wildlife crime of some sort, it's always going to be really difficult when we've got no witnesses. But do report it and report the circumstances to us. There's always going to be inquiries that we can make with neighbours. potentially CCTV inquiries. There's stuff we can do, but do report it, and we will look into it.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. We had a question before the webinar came in. It's a fairly long question here. Essential agreement of successful and sustainable access is respect. And rural communities, we have been welcoming folk visiting our areas, but the ongoing disrespect and disregard shown to our livestock, wildlife, and ourselves, that mood is changing. Access rights, if you do so responsible, and the opposite, we are seeing an alarming increase right across the country. The revision of the Scottish Outdoor Access Code would be of paramount importance in effectively clearing away much of the ambiguity used to excuse the actions of irresponsible access takers, and would be a step in the right direction to safeguard the welfare of livestock and the mental health and well-being of the custodian of the working landscape. When the general public are being encouraged more and more to visit the great outdoors by the powers that be and many other agents, why, for example, are we not seeing on primetime TV the possible consequences of irresponsible access taking, especially with regards to dogs? This is a fairly long question, but I suspect that's more a political thing that our political leaders should be tackling. Would you agree, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's a place for the police to answer that one, to be honest, Peter. It's very much a political question.
And Ramsay, do you have something? Do you want to say anything on that?
Difficult from the legal perspective to add anything in terms of the code. What I would say is that the question ends with, like, I think, a query about press coverage and primetime television. All I would say on that is that I think that what the question is designed at is, can we get greater press coverage before something happens with a view to deterring it, rather than the press always only reporting after the event. That's the way the press works. They will report on incidents because that's what, unfortunately, is of interest to the public. Better to have that sort of press report. The Kelty one's a good example. That was on headline BBC News, at least until other news took over today's press reporting. So that sort of press reporting, and I've seen an increase in the press reporting, I think is helpful. I think it will start spreading that message that this is really important and it's to be discouraged.
Thank you. I've got a question here from Kenny Barker. I am a crofter who has sheep on common grazings. Does anyone know where we could get educational leaflets for dog walkers? Thanks. Well,
Yeah.
I know NSA have things like that, and Farmers Guardian have seen, and NFU have things saying keep dogs on a lead. Mike, you have something to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, Peter, that NFU have definitely got leaflets. They've also got plastic signs that you can put up on fence posts. I was at the Thainston show last month and they were really popular. You'll also get leaflets from your local dog warden. So your local council dog warden will have leaflets, and also probably your local access officer as well for the council. That out there that can be used. But NFU is a good starting point because they've got these plastic things that you can put on fences round about fields.
Yeah, that it's an NFU one that we have on our gate saying, keep your dog on a lead. Right, okay. How do you feel that the police could be better equipped to deal with these incidents?
I think the legislation's there. It's the need for corroboration in these circumstances. I think the legislation's fit for purpose, and it's good legislation. It's just the need for evidence and prosecution, and that requirement for corroboration, which is always very, very difficult in remote countryside areas. Whether it's livestock worrying or a wildlife offence, it's always going to be very, very difficult. But I think the legislation's good.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. If the panelists had one wish on the future matters of sheep worrying by dogs, what would it be?
Well, I go first, Peter.
Yes, on you go. Ramsay
that we
guy?
have we have a sheriff who imposes a fine far closer to the 40k maximum than has done in the past. That's the message sent home. You hit people in the wallets, and there'll be press reporting of that fine. Other sheriffs will be willing to do the same, and people who are dog owners will sit up and take notice.
I agree wholehearted with you there. I think that's the main thing. If we have high profile cases that are fined that big 40k, then suddenly people will start to take notice. You want to say anything, Mike?
Yeah, for me, I'd love to see a greater understanding and respect for our countryside and the people that work in it. I think there's in a personal point of view, there's a big disjoint between people that come to the countryside and use it at the weekend, and very little understanding of what goes on there, and yeah, just a greater respect for our countryside.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. Can I just point out that there's a very good, on the Police Scotland website, that I accidentally clicked on one of the links today. I don't know how I managed it, but there's a very good bit on the Police Scotland website. Grace, if you could put that on so that people could click on it, because it's all about livestock attacks and worrying, and all the various hoops that we have to jump through, and that's really worth going through that page on the Police Scotland website. I'm not sure how we got there, but how I got there. But if you could put the link on, so we can see it and click on it, because it's a very useful page on the Police Scotland website. Grace, have you any wishes that you would like to see to highlight the problem?
I think it's been well covered by Ramsay and Mike already, but I'll come in a slightly middle ground where that to prevent future occurrences, people should ultimately take responsibility of their actions, and by extension of that, the actions of their dogs when outside in the countryside. So look at the Scottish Outdoor Access Code, have a bit of common sense, know where the livestock are, and be aware of anything that could happen. It's not just for your own protection, it's for the livestock protection, and it's for everyone else that also accesses the countryside with you on that given time, date, day, whatever it is when you're out and about.
Thank you, Grace. Well, it's nearly it's just after 8 o'clock now. We're scheduled to last an hour. We've had some good questions. Thank you very much for those who give questions. I think we've had a lot of food for thought. It's still daylight. I want to go out and see some cows before it gets dark. So I would just like to thank most sincerely Ramsay and Michael for attending our webinar and giving us good sound advice, and Grace for keeping everything together. So if you could all applaud quietly at home and thank them for their efforts. And I hope you've all learned something. Thank you very much. And I hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you, everybody.